Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Miss Marple and Footsteps on the Staircase, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Miss Marple. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Bell at Greystone Tolled. Twice. An unexpected chime in the night heralds the first fracture in peace. It was a particularly still evening in the village of Little Wickford, one of those lingering September twilights when the hedgerows glowed with blackberries and the last swallows dipped low over golden fields. Smoke curled lazily from chimney pots, and the scent of peat fires mingled with the honeysuckle clinging to whitewashed walls. By 9 o'clock, only the occasional flicker of lamplight remained in cottage windows, and even the rustle of the sycamores beyond the vicarage garden seemed to hush in anticipation of nightfall. In such a place, one came to expect a certain constancy. The clink of teacups at Mrs. Draycott's tea shop, the clatter of Reverend Burrows' bicycle over the cobbled lane, the bell at Greystone Manor tolling promptly at 10 each evening. 3 slow, resonant chimes that echoed through the village, marking the hour with a quiet, ancestral dignity. So when, at precisely 10 minutes past 10, the bell tolled again, twice, there was a moment, no more than a breath, in which the entire village seemed to pause. Miss Marple, seated by the window in her parlour at Hillside Cottage, raised her head from her knitting. A faint furrow lined her brow. "How very odd," she murmured, eyes narrowing slightly behind her spectacles. "It never tolls twice." The same moment, a curtain twitched at the post office. The landlord of the Green Hart paused mid-pint, and young Ivy Tresswell, walking home from her aunt's cottage, stopped short on the lane, one hand to her mouth. Odd, yes, but not until the next morning did the villagers understand that those 2 unexpected chimes had marked the final moments of Colonel Everard Fawcett. Greystone Manor sat upon the rise above the village, grand and aloof behind its wrought-iron gates and crumbling stone lions. The colonel, retired from India some 10 years previous, had returned to the ancestral home alone, save for a sour-faced housekeeper, Mrs. Kellett, and his younger sister, Miss Honoria Fawcett, who had never married and spoke frequently of standard slipping and young women's morals. Colonel Fawcett was, by most accounts, a difficult man. He was known for his rigid sense of propriety, a curiously intense passion for church architecture, and a taste for strong cigars and harsh judgments. He had quarrelled with nearly everyone at one time or another. The vicar over the removal of pews, Mr. Denning at the mill over boundary hedges, and even with the parish council over the placement of a commemorative bench. Yet he was a fixture, as entrenched in Little Wickford as the ancient yew in the churchyard. So when Martha Kellett found him the next morning, slumped in the library chair with his reading spectacles still perched on his nose and a half-written letter beside him, she let out a sharp scream that startled the starlings into flight. The doctor, summoned post-haste, declared it was not natural causes. "Poison," he said quietly to Inspector Crail, who had motored in from the county station. "Something quick, possibly in the whiskey." Inspector Crail was tall, red-faced, and spoke with the weary briskness of a man used to petty thefts and poached pheasants. A murder at a manor house, especially one involving a colonel, was not at all to his liking. Could be suicide, he muttered, eyeing the glass. Any signs he was depressed? Colonel Fawcett was many things, replied Honoria coldly, but never what one might call sensitive. He had no reason to take his own life. Crail grunted. Anyone else in the house last night? Myself, Martha, and his valet, Jennings. None of us heard a thing. Though, she added with a touch of hesitation, Martha said she thought she heard the bell ring twice after 10. Crail glanced toward the grandfather clock in the hall. Mechanical malfunction, maybe. Miss Marple, who had arrived by invitation of her old friend Honoria and stood demurely in the corner, gave a polite cough. If I may, Inspector, she said gently, I should think a bell at Greystone doesn't toll without someone pulling the rope. Crail frowned. And you are? Miss Marple? I've known Honoria since we were girls in Tunbridge Wells. Crail nodded, faintly exasperated. He had, of course, heard of Miss Marple, who in the local parlance had a knack for getting to the bottom of things, but he was not one to encourage amateur sleuthing. Back in the village, the news spread like spilled ink. At Mrs. Draycott's, customers lingered over crumpets and speculations. Well, I heard the colonel was rewriting his will, murmured Mrs. Patch, peering over her pince-nez. Likely to cut someone out, I shouldn't wonder, added Mr. Goodbody the grocer. He said as much to me last week, seemed in. Then Miss Clara Burnham, the schoolteacher, quiet, reserved, but said to have had a rather close friendship with the colonel some years before, and rumour had it he'd promised to help her purchase a cottage, which he never did. And of course Jennings, the valet, loyal but weary, perhaps resentful of a lifetime's servitude, and recently overheard arguing with the colonel about what was due. Miss Marple walked home that afternoon by way of the churchyard, pausing at the sundial and pretending to adjust her gloves. In truth, she was considering not only who had the opportunity, but who possessed the kind of temperament that might commit murder in such a deliberate, quiet fashion. Not a crime of passion. No, this was something planned, something symbolic. 2 chimes, not 3. People so often reveal themselves, she said aloud to the drowsy tabby who watched her from the vicarage wall. In the smallest things, a missing chime, a half-written letter, a bell, tolled twice when it never should. She smiled faintly, then resumed her walk, the soft click of her shoes blending with the rustling leaves. The first fracture in the village's calm had been struck, and as Miss Marple well knew, it would take more than a pot of tea to mend what came next, and someone in Little Wickford, was hiding the truth. But not for long. Chapter 2. A lace handkerchief in the rose garden. Too delicate to belong to the gardener, too damning to be misplaced. The morning following Colonel Fawcett's death dawned cool and bright, with a peculiar hush hanging over Little Wickford. A faint breeze stirred the leaves in the chestnut trees, and the sun glinted gently on the diamond-paned windows of ivy-covered cottages. From the lane outside, Hillside Cottage, came the rhythmic clink of a milk cart and the soft, early chatter of birdsong. The village, though calm in appearance, carried an unmistakable tension, like a church organ holding its breath between notes. Miss Marple, seated at her breakfast table, delicately buttered her toast with practiced precision. She had already been out in the garden that morning, clipping back the delphiniums and making quiet mental notes, as was her way. There was always something to be gleaned in the early hours. A glance too quickly averted, an awkward pause between villagers exchanging pleasantries, or, as she had observed, Mrs. Denning's hasty walk to the vicarage at a most uncustomary time. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. 3 sharp raps, brisk and businesslike. It was Honoria Fawcett. "My dear Jane," she said, sweeping into the parlour with that slightly regal bearing common to unmarried gentlewomen of a certain age, "you must come at once. Something rather compromising has been found in the rose garden." Miss Marple did not require elaboration. She merely set down her toast and reached for her gloves. The rose garden at Greystone Manor was a place of orderly beauty, an old-fashioned arrangement of beds radiating from a central sundial, each bordered with clipped box hedges. The blooms were past their prime now, many petals tinged with brown at the edges, but the perfume lingered thick in the still air. Beneath a peace rose, where the dew still clung in silver droplets, the housekeeper, Mrs. Kellett, stood with her face pale and tight. "It was Jennings who found it, miss," she said, without preamble, while raking up the windfall apples. Looked down, and there it was, caught on one of the thorns, clear as day. She held out a handkerchief, pinched between 2 gloved fingers. It was dainty, made of fine white lace, with a monogram delicately stitched in one corner. C.B. Miss Marple accepted it with a nod. She did not unfold it entirely, merely examined the embroidery and the fabrics, gossamer weave. "Quite a fine piece," she said quietly. "Not the sort one drops without noticing, and certainly not the sort that belongs to a gentleman's valet or housekeeper," added Honoria. "Miss Burnham's, surely. I recognize the stitchwork. She often embroiders gifts for the church fete." Miss Clara Burnham had taught at the village school for over 15 years. A quiet, introspective woman of excellent reputation, known for her unwavering punctuality and somewhat severe hairstyle. She was also, as Miss Marple recalled, once the object of the Colonel's particular attention, an attention that had waned as quickly as it had bloomed. "She's been seen in the rose garden before," Honoria added. "Often, in fact, though not since the quarrel." Miss Marple looked up. "Quarrel?" Honoria's lips tightened. "Over a loan. She asked him for help. Something to do with a mortgage or cottage repairs. He refused. Rather harshly, I understand." "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly, turning her attention back to the handkerchief. That afternoon, word of the discovery had trickled into every parlour and post office corner. By tea-time, the Green Hearts clientele were speaking of little else. Miss Burnham, when she was seen walking across the green toward the stationer's, had the pinched look of someone acutely aware she was being watched. Inspector Crail returned to Greystone that evening, grimmer than ever. "She says she must have dropped it days ago," he told Miss Marple gruffly, standing in the manor library where the Colonel had last been seen alive. "Claims she often walked that way after school, that it was nothing more than an accident. But how does one lose such a thing on a bush without noticing?" Miss Marple gave a gentle sigh. "One might lose it if one were in distress. Distracted, possibly after an upsetting encounter, but then one might also place it deliberately." The inspector frowned. "A plant?" Miss Marple did not reply. Her gaze had drifted to the writing desk in the corner, tidy, but with the faint impression of paper on the blotter. She stepped closer. "The Colonel was writing a letter when he died, wasn't he?" "Indeed," Crail said. "It was addressed to his solicitor. Nothing very revealing, only that he intended to make revisions to his will. Didn't specify the changes." She nodded slowly. "So we know he planned to disinherit someone, or possibly to re-include someone." Motives aplenty, Crail muttered. The nephew, of course. Fancied himself the heir. Then there's Jennings. Been with the Colonel for decades. Expected a bequest. And Miss Burnham, Miss Marple added softly, who might have been promised help, and felt the sting of a broken promise rather more than she admitted. The inspector rubbed his chin. And yet it all feels a bit too neat. Lace in the garden, right where it can be found. Convenient, wouldn't you say? Quite, said Miss Marple, her eyes bright. People often believe that women's belongings are damning enough on their own. A man may leave muddy footprints, a tobacco tin, or worse, and it may be overlooked. But a lady's handkerchief, far more scandalous. As she left the manor that evening, the sun was setting over the fields beyond the village, casting long shadows across the stone walls and the vicarage lawn. Miss Marple paused at the church gate, noting the low hum of bees still circling the lavender, and the sharp scent of newly turned soil from the graveyard. She had no proof, not yet, but she had observed Clara Burnham's reaction upon hearing that her handkerchief had been discovered. Not the alarm of someone caught out, nor the confusion of someone falsely accused. Rather, it had been a deep weariness, the weariness of one who had expected for quite some time that everything would eventually come undone. Miss Marple adjusted her handbag, then continued down the lane. There were more threads to follow, to be sure, but already the pattern was beginning to emerge, and as every knitter knows, once you've seen the first few rows properly, the rest comes into view quite naturally. And somewhere in the village, perhaps in a drawing room, perhaps in a scullery, someone was waiting to see if their clever misdirection had taken hold. But Miss Marple had lived long enough in villages to know that roses, like secrets, often conceal thorns. And lace, though delicate, can be rather telling when one knows what to look for. Chapter 3. Whispers beneath the oak panelling. The drawing room hears what no one will repeat aloud. The drawing room at Greystone Manor had always seemed rather too solemn for comfort. Wainscoted in heavy oak and adorned with ancestral portraits of unsmiling faucets, it bore the peculiar hush of a place that remembered too much and forgave too little. Even in daylight, the room felt shadowed, and its vast fireplace, though often lit, seemed to cast more gloom than warmth. On this particular morning, the air within was taut with suppressed emotion. The fire crackled, sending the occasional snap, echoing beneath the beamed ceiling, while the long case clock in the corner ticked with ponderous self-importance. Miss Marple sat quietly in a straight-backed chair by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap, observing rather than participating. She had long since learned that people spoke most freely when they had forgotten you were present. Honoria Fawcett presided from the winged armchair near the hearth, upright and composed in her dove-grey wool. Opposite her sat Mr. Leonard Fawcett, the Colonel's nephew, who had arrived from London just the day before the murder and was now uncharacteristically subdued. Between them, on the low walnut table, rested a silver tea service, untouched save for one half-empty cup. "I cannot believe," Leonard was saying, with carefully measured indignation, "that anyone truly thinks I had anything to do with this ghastly business. The man was difficult, yes, but one doesn't poison one's own uncle simply for being disagreeable." Honoria arched a brow. "One might if one expected to inherit." "I hadn't spoken to the old devil in nearly a year," Leonard replied too quickly. "We'd quarrelled about money, as you well know. He threatened to cut me off, but that hardly means I'd kill him." "No," Honoria said coolly. "It only means you had motive, opportunity, and an inconvenient temper." Leonard's lips tightened. He glanced toward Miss Marple, who gave him a small, placid smile. "I suppose I should be grateful the vicar wasn't invited to this little tribunal," he muttered. "On the contrary," said Honoria, "he was invited, but he's visiting the infirmary today. A mercy for you, I dare say." There was a beat of silence, filled only by the tick of the clock and the faint gust of wind beyond the leaded windows. Miss Marple noted the tension in Leonard's jaw, the way his fingers tapped nervously against the porcelain cup. She had seen that sort of tapping before, in a young man in St. Mary Mead who had taken to borrowing from the church fund under the pretense of accounting errors. That same subtle drumming, revealing far more than the speaker intended. "Would you say," she asked gently, "that the Colonel was troubled of late? Reflective, perhaps?" Leonard gave a short laugh. "The Colonel? He reflected only on other people's faults." "Still," said Miss Marple, "it strikes me as interesting that he was writing a letter to his solicitor the night he died." This remark, seemingly innocent, brought a visible flicker across Leonard's face, something between irritation and unease. It passed quickly, but not quickly enough. Honoria caught it as well. He was indeed, though he didn't say what changes he intended to make. "Of course," she added, her voice like a knife wrapped in velvet, "he had mentioned to me that the will might soon reflect his true affections." Leonard stood abruptly. "If this is to be an inquisition, I shall take my leave." Miss Marple regarded him mildly. "Oh, I don't think anyone is being inquisitorial, Mr. Fawcett. But I do think people are often rather more transparent than they believe, particularly when they're agitated." After he left the room, the air settled into a heavier quiet. Honoria rose and crossed to the fire, adjusting a log with a brass poker. "Jane," she said, with a sigh more wearied than theatrical, "he resents us all, you know. Always has. Even as a child, he was sly, too clever for his own good. He was wild at university. Dreadful friends, endless debts. My brother bailed him out again and again." "And yet," said Miss Marple gently, "your brother still kept him in the will." "Or so we assumed." Honoria gave her a look, brief but guarded. Miss Marple stood and moved to the far end of the room, where a narrow door, half concealed by a heavy tapestry, stood ajar. "Such thick walls," she murmured, brushing a hand along the paneling. "And yet, one forgets how well oak carries sound, especially in still houses." Honoria turned. "Sound? Whispers, for example," said Miss Marple, gazing at the tapestry. "People think drawing rooms are discreet places. They forget servants pass through to stoke the fire or collect a tray, or that the pantry on the other side of the wall has a vent behind the china cabinet. One hears a great deal more than one ought." Honoria stiffened. "Are you suggesting someone overheard something the Colonel said?" "I rather think," said Miss Marple, "that someone meant to overhear something, perhaps a conversation regarding the will, or the letter, or even a confession." Outside, a clock chimed 4:30. Somewhere beyond the garden, a dog barked, then fell silent. Miss Marple reached for her gloves and small handbag. "I do believe," she said calmly, "that Jennings the valet knows, rather, more than he's letting on, and I should very much like to speak with Miss Burnham again, alone, this time." "You suspect her?" Honoria asked. Miss Marple paused at the door. "I never suspect anyone, my dear. I simply observe. And then, like embroidery, the pattern begins to emerge. One simply needs to sit still long enough to see it." She let herself out, leaving the drawing room once more in hushed silence. The fire crackled faintly. The old portraits peered down, as if recalling Generations of secrets whispered within those oak-clad walls. But this secret, this murder, would not remain concealed for long. Not with Miss Marple listening. Chapter 4. Fog over Bramley Common. Mists conceal more than footsteps on the path to murder. The fog had crept in during the small hours, so that by morning, Bramley Common was all but swallowed whole. The trees stood like gaunt sentinels, their branches softened into smudged outlines, while the narrow footpaths that crossed the heath had vanished beneath a gauze of grey. The church spire was obscured, its bell ringing for morning prayers, heard but unseen, and the hedgerows along the Wickford like the fog itself. Colonel Fawcett's death had caused a quiet rupture in the village's delicate routine, and now the ripples were beginning to spread. A lace handkerchief, a half-written letter, whispers behind oak panelling, and still the truth lay just out of reach. Miss Marple had decided upon a walk. Bramley Common stretched to the east of the village, a modest tract of heathland, crisscrossed by rabbit runs and narrow trails, bordered on one side by the orchard at Greystone Manor and on the other by the grounds of the now abandoned Rivington House, long shuttered since the war. It was here that villagers often walked their dogs, picked blackberries in late summer, or held the annual Maypole picnic. But on this morning, the common was nearly deserted. Nearly, at the edge of the orchard fence, just beyond the reach of the tall elms, Miss Marple came upon young Ivy Tresswell. The girl started at the sound of approaching footsteps and dropped something into her coat pocket. "Miss Marple, oh, you gave me such a fright." "I'm terribly sorry, my dear. The fog does play tricks with one's nerves." Miss Marple looked at the girl closely. Her cheeks were pink from cold, or perhaps from something else. "Taking a shortcut?" "Yes, no, just out for a walk," Ivy said quickly. "Clears the head." "Quite. I always find fog clarifies more than it clouds, though few would agree." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the pocket. "And have you found anything on your walk this morning? Nature often leaves such curious treasures in our path." Ivy hesitated, then pulled from her coat a man's glove, soft leather, worn at the thumb, damp from dew. Miss Marple took it delicately between her fingers. "Interesting," she said. "And not a lady's glove, certainly. May I ask where you found it?" "Near the gate to the orchard, on the ground." "Indeed." Miss Marple tucked it into her reticule without asking. "Best not to let such things fall into idle hands, don't you think?" Ivy looked down, biting her lip. "Do you think it's important to the murder?" Miss Marple's tone remained mild. "I think that everything is important, my dear, especially what others consider trivial." Later that day, Miss Marple made her way to the Green Hart. The village inn, modest but respectable, was known not only for its plum jam and respectable claret, but also for housing the occasional visitor or wayward relative. Like Leonard Fawcett, he had taken a room there after the colonel's body had been discovered, claiming Greystone held too many unpleasant associations. She found him in the lounge, nursing a whiskey and reading the Times with more attentiveness than conviction. "Miss Marple," he said, with a forced smile, "to what do I owe this pleasure?" "I was just walking back from the common," she said, settling into the wing-back chair opposite him. "Nasty business, this fog." "I find it quite soothing," Leonard replied. "Covers up all the dreadful things." And yet it revealed something quite interesting today. A glove, a man's glove, near the orchard gate. Leonard looked up, sharply. "Really?" "Yes. A very fine glove, but damaged. Worn at the thumb. A gentleman's, but not overly new. I believe it was your glove, Mr. Fawcett. There was a pause, then a shrug. Could be. I've lost a few. Not unusual. No, Miss Marple said, her voice pleasant, though it was found rather close to where the Colonel's gardener saw someone the night he died. A man, tall, wearing a dark coat, leaving the orchard path just after 10. Very near the time the bell tolled, oddly. Leonard's jaw clenched. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything, only suggesting that perhaps your presence on the grounds that night was not entirely accounted for. I went for a walk, I told the inspector. Yes, and said you retired directly after, but someone did not. Someone rang. The bell again, at 10 past. A rather peculiar action, unless it were to establish a different time of death. Leonard stood. This is absurd. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. Perhaps. But then again, absurdity often hides truth. You see, people forget how village life sharpens one's instincts. I've seen more petty grievances and passionate tempers over a cake recipe or a church flower rota than one might find in a London court. I'm not staying here to be accused. I'm not accusing you, Mr. Fawcett, she said, rising, but I am saying that you were afraid of something that night, or someone. Perhaps you thought your uncle was changing his will again. Perhaps you feared what it might mean for your future. Leonard stared at her, saying nothing. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, thinning into wisps as the sun pressed through the morning's grey. Miss Marple returned home, along the hedgerows, her mind gently sifting through the day's encounters. Ivy, Tresswell, startled and secretive. Leonard, defensive and evasive. The glove, the orchard path, the second chime of the Greystone bell. She passed the tea shop, where Mrs. Patch was discussing the Colonel's will in scandalized tones, and the churchyard, where Reverend Burrows knelt by the flower beds, murmuring quietly to himself. Life in Little Wickford went on, with its scones and its scandals, its mists and mysteries. But even as the fog lifted, the deeper haze, the tangle of motives and lies remained. Yet Miss Marple had lived through many such fogs, and she knew with a certainty born of years and quiet observation that beneath the softest silences often lay the hardest truths. And so she walked on, knitting needles in her bag, thoughts as sharp and shining as pins, prepared to tug gently at the threads no one else could see. The fog had cleared, but the path to murder was just beginning to take shape. Chapter 5. The Shattered Teacup at Number 4. A civil visit ends with porcelain on the floor and questions in the air. Number 4. Wisteria Cottages stood halfway down Church Lane. Its thatched roof bowed like an old bonnet, and its garden, though small, meticulously tended. Climbing roses still clung stubbornly to bloom, and a stone squirrel, perpetually nibbling at a nut, stood vigil by the low gate. The curtains in the parlour windows were of Nottingham lace, the kind handed down through generations and washed with rainwater and vinegar, as old Mrs. Tresswell always maintained. Inside, Clara Burnham had laid the tea-table with her usual care. Bone china cups, patterned with forget-me-nots, sat on embroidered doilies. There was Dundee cake, neatly sliced, and lemon-curd tarts. Clara, always slender and self-contained, wore a dove-blue cardigan, and her hair pinned as precisely as ever, but her hands trembled faintly as she reached for the teapot. "You really shouldn't have gone to such trouble," said Miss Marple gently, accepting a cup. "But it is a lovely spread. So comforting in troubled times." Clara attempted a smile. "I find routine helps. If I stop for too long, I begin to think. And lately, the village seems to offer little but things to think about." Miss Marple nodded, sipping her tea. The china cup was warm between her fingers. Clara Burnham was not an excitable woman. Her quietness was of the enduring sort, formed not from shyness, but from long habit. She had taught half the village to spell conscience and February, and to recite the kings and queens of England in reverse. But now her own conscience appeared unsettled. "You were close to Colonel Fawcett, I believe," Miss Marple said, in an even tone. Clara stiffened almost imperceptibly. "We were friends, in a manner of speaking." "A manner of speaking," Miss Marple repeated softly. "I believe he once promised to assist you in purchasing a cottage." Clara set her cup down with exaggerated care. "He mentioned it, but that was some time ago. He withdrew the offer. And it upset you." "I am not in the habit of quarrelling with gentlemen over money, Miss Marple." "No, I rather think not. But disappointments can be sharper when they come from those we've permitted to know us well." For a moment, neither woman spoke. The grandfather clock in the hall struck three precise chimes that echoed lightly through the quiet parlor. Then, without warning, there came a shattering sound, sharp, final. Clara's teacup had slipped from her hand and lay in fragments on the carpet. The tea had spread in a pale stain. "Oh," she cried, snatching at a cloth, "how clumsy, how very clumsy of me." "Not clumsy," Miss Marple said softly, already rising. Startled, Clara's face flushed. I've had little sleep of late. This business with the Colonel, it's been so difficult." Miss Marple crouched carefully, retrieving a larger shard of porcelain. "Difficult because of his death? Or what might come to light after it?" Clara's breath hitched, just a fraction. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple handed her the piece. "People often imagine that the dead take their secrets with them. But they rarely do, especially when their lives intersect with others so closely." Clara stood very still, her face turned slightly away. "Are you suggesting I had anything to do with his death?" Miss Marple straightened, her knees creaking faintly. "No, my dear. I am suggesting only that you are frightened, and people are never frightened without reason." A knock came at the front door, 2 polite raps. Clara moved to answer it, grateful for the interruption. On the doorstep stood Ivy Tresswell, cap in hand, cheeks flushed. "Sorry to disturb, Miss Burnham," she said, breathlessly. "Miss Marple, I've just come from the vicarage. Reverend Burrows said I was to fetch you. Inspector Crail's there. There's been something's been found." Miss Marple took her hat from the stand, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Ivy. I'll come at once." Clara followed them to the door. "Miss Marple," she said suddenly, her voice low, "if he had changed his will, if he was planning to undo everything, what happens to those promises that were made, even if never written down?" Miss Marple paused. "It depends, my dear. Some promises are merely spoken. Others are etched in guilt or fear or desperation. And those," she added gently, "have a way of haunting people." She left Clara standing in the doorway, hands clutched in front of her apron. The tea had cooled on the table. A single slice of cake remained, untouched. Outside, the autumn air was brisk and dry, the sky the color of washed-out cornflowers. At the vicarage, Inspector Crail was waiting, arms folded tightly across his chest, as Miss Marple arrived. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, without preamble. "We've uncovered something in the ash heap behind Greystone Manor. Letter fragments, partly burned, enough to read a name. Miss Marple's expression did not change. "Ah, a draft of the letter to the solicitor. Seems likely. Suggests he was considering striking her from the will entirely. Then it's curious he never sent it." Crail raised an eyebrow. "You think she found it, read it, decided to act?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Her gaze drifted toward the vicar's window, where the churchyard stones stood like old memories beneath the trees. "I think," she said softly, "that someone wanted us to believe she did. But motives can be manufactured, just as teacups can be shattered. The trick is knowing what broke by accident and what was dropped on purpose." Crail scowled. "So you don't believe she did it?" "I believe Miss Burnham is holding something back," Miss Marple replied. "But not, I suspect, because she's guilty. Sometimes people conceal the truth for reasons of dignity, or shame, or love." Crail gave a short laugh. "Love in a murder case?" Miss Marple looked at him mildly. "One must never underestimate the power of a bruised heart, or the secrets it's willing to keep buried." As she made her way homeward, the village lane seemed quiet again, almost too quiet. Number 4 stood with its curtains drawn now, and the roses drooped slightly in the afternoon sun. But within its parlour, a china cup lay broken, and a woman sat alone with thoughts she could not bear to voice aloud. And all the while, the threads wound tighter, the tapestry of lies and truths growing ever more intricate. But Miss Marple had her needles ready, and she knew the pattern would reveal itself. Sooner or later, even shattered porcelain tells a story. One only needs to know how to read the cracks. Chapter 6. Footsteps on the staircase. Late at night, someone ascends, but never descends. The lamps in Little Wickford burned low that night, their golden halos barely illuminating the misty air beyond lace-curtained windows. A hush lay over the village, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the soft hoot of an owl drifting from the churchyard yews. It was a night best spent by the fire, with woolen shawls and a warm pot of cocoa, and most of the villagers had done just that. Greystone Manor, however, did not rest so easily. It was just past 1 in the morning when Martha Kellett, the housekeeper, awoke with a start. At first she thought it was the wind rattling the shutters again. There had been a loose pane for years in the upstairs corridor. But no, this was different. A sound too deliberate, too rhythmic. Footsteps. Martha sat upright, clutching the edge of her counterpane. The creaking of the old staircase was unmistakable. Tread by tread, someone was ascending. Not hurriedly, nor stealthily, but with the quiet, deliberate pacing of someone who belonged in the house, or someone who wanted others to think they did. She reached for her dressing gown with trembling fingers and crept to her door, opening it a crack. The corridor was in darkness, but the faint glow of moonlight through the high, stained glass landing window cast shifting patterns on the floorboards. No sound now, only silence. Yet she was certain she had heard it. Certain. And then, a moment later, the creak again, on the upper landing. Martha pulled the door closed and fumbled for her crucifix, whispering a prayer. It wasn't the first strange thing that had occurred since the colonel's death, and the servants, those few that remained, had taken to muttering about the bell tolling itself and cold draughts in locked rooms. But this was real. By morning, the household was abuzz with speculation. Jennings, the valet, insisted he'd heard nothing. Though he looked pale and had a small scratch on his cheek he claimed came from shaving. Miss Honoria Fawcett summoned Miss Marple to the drawing-room with uncharacteristic urgency. The elder Miss Fawcett, never one to indulge in superstition, now seemed visibly unsettled. "It was footsteps, Jane," she said, seated bolt upright on the settee, with her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Martha's no hysteric. And the staircase creaked, she says. Up, but not down, as if someone went to the Colonel's rooms and never returned." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And were the rooms locked?" "Locked, as always. I checked them myself. The key is kept in my bureau drawer. No sign of disturbance." "And yet someone entered them," Miss Marple murmured. "Or wanted it thought they had." A faint frown creased her brow. There was something theatrical about it all, about footsteps in the night and bells tolling twice. Someone was orchestrating a story. But to what end? She requested to see the staircase. It was a fine one, carved oak, with a carved finial in the shape of a hunting hound at the base. The treads were slightly worn in the center from years of use. Miss Marple ran her fingers lightly along the banister, then paused at the fifth step. She pressed gently. It creaked, just as Martha had said. "Tell me," she said to Honoria, "does anyone else in the house use this staircase regularly? Besides yourself, Martha, and Jennings?" "No. It's the private stair, for family and staff. Visitors use the front." Miss Marple examined the dust along the edges, disrupted in one patch by something broader than a shoe. A scuff, perhaps, or someone carrying something. She said nothing, only made a mental note. That afternoon, she stopped by the tea shop, where the usual cluster of village matrons huddled over their embroidery and speculations. Mrs. Patch was in fine form, her sharp nose twitching with gossip. "Well, I heard there was a disturbance last week," she said, tapping her teaspoon. "Before the Colonel died. Raised voices. Someone banging about upstairs." "Honoria would never allow it," sniffed Mrs. Draycott. "Oh, it wasn't Honoria," said Mrs. Patch with relish. "It was him, that nephew, Leonard. He was seen leaving the manor late that evening, before he moved into the inn. Dreadfully red in the face, I'm told." Miss Marple listened, knitting in hand, her needles clicking softly. Patterns again, just like in lace. Regularity, and then disruption. One odd stitch, and the whole thing warps. Leonard had been in the house, more often than he'd admitted. She left shortly after and walked to the inn. Leonard Fawcett met her with a guarded expression, as if expecting some new accusation. "Come to scold me again, Miss Marple." "Not at all, Mr. Fawcett. Only to ask about a night before your uncle's death. A night you left Greystone in rather a state." His eyes narrowed. "You've been listening to village tongues again, have you?" "Village tongues, as you call them, are sometimes more precise than official records." He paced. "It was a misunderstanding. He accused me of stealing. A letter, of all things. Said I'd gone into his study without permission. He was furious." "Did you?" Leonard hesitated. "Yes, but not to steal. I'd heard, well, I knew he was changing his will. I only wanted to see how badly I'd been cut out. He caught me, threatened to call the police. But he didn't. No, he cooled off, said he'd deal with me another way. I took that to mean I'd be left nothing. So I left. Except," Miss Marple said quietly, "you returned. That night, and again the night after he died." He froze. "What are you talking about?" "The footsteps, Mr. Fawcett. You see, you were seen. Perhaps not by people, but by dust and by old wood that creaks beneath unfamiliar weight." His hands clenched at his sides. "I didn't kill him. I believe you, but I also believe you know who did." He sank into a chair, eyes hollow. "I thought it was Clara," he said at last. "She had the most to lose. But then, that night, I saw someone, on the staircase, slipping into the corridor. Not Clara, a man." Miss Marple said nothing, only waited. "I didn't recognize him, only the coat. Jennings's. But it wasn't Jennings." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "It wasn't. I think you saw someone borrowing a disguise, a very old trick. The coat, the silence, the late hour, designed to mislead." Leonard looked up, startled. "Then who?" Miss Marple rose. "I shall tell you soon, Mr. Fawcett, but not here." She returned to Hillside Cottage, with her knitting untouched and her thoughts swirling like leaves in wind. Footsteps on a staircase, a bell tolled twice, a glove by the orchard gate, a handkerchief in the rose garden. All were fragments, but now they began to arrange themselves into a shape, a human shape, deceptive, clever, and deadly. The next morning, she would speak with Inspector Crail. There was still one piece missing, but it would come, she felt sure, because someone had ascended that staircase with purpose, but had not descended. At least, not the same person they had been when they went up. And Miss Marple, as always, had heard every step. Chapter 7. The Vicar's Second Sermon. Fire and brimstone thinly veils an inconvenient truth. It was a blustery Sunday in Little Wickford, the kind of morning when the hedgerows bowed under the weight of wind-whipped leaves and the bells of St. Mildred's rang out with a mournful resonance across the damp village green. Congregants arrived with scarves pulled high and hats pinned low, boots muddy from the lane, their expressions sober and watchful beneath their Sabbath best. Inside the small stone church, candles flickered stubbornly against the draughts, and the scent of damp wool mingled with aged hymnals and a faint trace of beeswax polish. Miss Marple, seated 3 rows from the front, removed her gloves slowly and laid them neatly beside her hymn book. Her face was composed, though her eyes missed nothing, not the whispered exchange between Mr. Denning and his wife, nor the awkward glance Leonard Fawcett cast toward the chancel. At precisely 10:30, Reverend Burrows ascended the pulpit. A kindly man with thinning hair and an unfortunate fondness for Latin quotes, he was known for his mild, forgettable sermons on the grace of patience or the joy of small kindnesses. But today, there was a curious edge to his voice, a tremor of something not unlike conviction or warning. "My brethren," he began, his tone deeper than usual, "we gather here this morning with heavy hearts. The shadow of death has touched our village, and like the veil that hung in the temple, so too has a veil fallen between us and comfort." There was a faint stir in the pews. "We know, do we not, the burden of sin, the sting of pride, the blindness of ambition, the folly of envy, and yet we walk in silence beside them, tolerating them in others, denying them in ourselves." Miss Marple tilted her head, her interest piqued. "For what is sin, if not the thing we pretend we cannot see? What is guilt, if not the thing we are afraid to name?" His eyes swept the congregation. "Let he who has ears hear." A hush followed. No coughing, no fidgeting, just the sound of wind pressing against the old glass windows and the distant caw of a rook. After the service, as the villagers filed out into the grey morning, the usual hum of greetings and gossip was conspicuously absent. The vicar's sermon had been unlike any they'd heard before, more admonition than comfort. "Quite a performance," muttered Mrs. Patch to Mrs. Draycott, adjusting her gloves with trembling fingers. He looked straight at Leonard Fawcett when he said envy, plain as day. Leonard had disappeared swiftly down the path, his hat pulled low, not waiting for polite conversation. Miss Marple, however, lingered. She waited until most of the crowd had dispersed, then made her way back inside the church, where Reverend Burrows was extinguishing the altar candles with a practiced hand. "A most compelling sermon," she said gently. He turned, surprised but not displeased. "Ah, Miss Marple, yes, well, unusual times call for unusual words, I suppose. You've always had a fondness for metaphor," she said mildly, "but I wonder whether today's sermon contained something rather more direct." He sighed, removing his surplice and folding it with meticulous care. "You know, I've long believed that truth has a peculiar echo, Jane. It bounces back at you, sooner or later, and lately I've heard quite a few echoes in this village." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "I have too." She moved toward the choir stalls, trailing her fingers lightly along the carved wood. "You know, I've often thought churches are the best places to observe character. People think because they are in the presence of holiness, their masks must drop. But I've found it's quite the opposite. They put on their finest ones here." Reverend Burrows gave a short, dry chuckle. "Spoken like a woman who knows the world." "I do know this village," she said softly, "and I know when someone is sitting under the weight of something unsaid. You looked at Leonard Fawcett quite meaningfully today." The vicar hesitated. "Because I know what I saw." She waited, patiently. He glanced at the great stained glass window above the nave, where St. George thrust his spear into a writhing serpent. "It was 2 nights before the colonel died. I was locking up the vestry late. There had been an extra choir practice for the harvest festival, and as I stepped out, I saw a figure coming out of Greystone's orchard path. At first, I thought it was the colonel himself. The way he walked, erect, purposeful. But it wasn't him. It was Leonard. I'm sure of it." "And you didn't mention this to the inspector?" The vicar looked genuinely troubled. "It wasn't my place, I thought. He'd just returned to the village. A respectable family. One doesn't like to make accusations." "One rarely likes to," said Miss Marple, "but sometimes one must." She paused. "May I ask something else, Reverend? Was it your idea to have the harvest festival postponed?" He blinked. "No. Jennings came to me privately. Said it would be too painful for the household. Asked very kindly." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Kindly? Jennings?" The vicar seemed confused. "Well, he did seem different. Not quite himself. I attributed it to grief." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind already turning. Later that afternoon, she returned to Hillside Cottage and sat for a long time in her parlour, the fire burning low, her knitting untouched in her lap. The puzzle was tightening. The clues were no longer scattered. Now they clustered like storm clouds before a downpour. A sermon about envy, a valet speaking out of character, a figure spotted in the orchard, and footsteps on a staircase that went up but never came down. The truth, she felt, had been spoken. Not directly, not openly, but veiled, like fire and brimstone, cloaking an inconvenient confession. And she, Jane Marple, of St. Mary Mead, was nearly ready to draw the veil back. Very nearly. Because, as she knew from a lifetime of quiet observation, guilt has a tone, a posture, a silence. It was now just a matter of listening closely enough to hear what the sermon had not said. Chapter 8. An invitation to Ravenscroft Hall. A gathering of old friends, one of whom cannot be trusted. Ravenscroft Hall had long stood brooding above the Weald, its stone facade half smothered in ivy, its mullioned windows glinting dully in the pale autumn light. Though grander and older than Greystone Manor, it had a quiet, melancholic dignity, as though remembering a time when laughter spilled from the ballroom, and lanterns danced beneath the lime trees, lining the drive. Miss Marple had not visited Ravenscroft in some years, though she had known the house, and those who lived in it, long enough to recall when the third Lady Elspeth Ravenscroft had scandalized the county by wearing French perfume to a village fete. It was she who had extended the invitation, in her familiar sloping hand. "My dear Jane, I feel it is high time we brought together a few familiar faces. So much darkness lately, so much heaviness. Let us have tea, light conversation, and perhaps the scent of honesty in the air again. Yours affectionately, Elspeth." Miss Marple had found the choice of words intriguing. Elspeth Ravenscroft, née Elspeth Pembroke, was no fool. The scent of honesty was not a phrase she used lightly, and so, with her gloves neatly buttoned and a small hat pinned in place, Miss Marple arrived promptly at 4 o'clock. Ushered in by a footman too young to understand he was witnessing a gathering layered in history and suspicion. The drawing-room had changed. The large carved fireplace still bore the Pembroke crest, the same tapestries lined the walls, and the tall windows, looking out over the west lawn, spilled light onto a tea table laden with silver and scones, sponge cake, and a glistening lemon tart. Elspeth was seated in her usual chair, upright, elegant, and faintly amused by the world. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and she wore a brooch shaped like a fox's head, its ruby eyes glinting. "Jane," she said warmly, extending a thin, ringed hand. "I knew you'd come." Also gathered were the Reverend Burrows, looking a little more pinched than usual. Mrs. Patch, who had never turned down an invitation with sponge cake involved, Honoria Fawcett, icily correct in navy blue, Clara Burnham, quiet and pale, and surprisingly, Leonard Fawcett, who appeared faintly out of place, even in a tailored suit. "I do so like the idea of old friends," Elspeth said once everyone was seated, "but I always find, don't you, that old friends often know too much." The remark was met with tight smiles and the sound of teacups being lifted with slightly more force than necessary. They talked, of course, of the weather, the dying roses in the churchyard, and the prospect of rationing being lifted by Christmas. But it was conversation with hollows in it, as though the fabric of civility was straining over something far more jagged. Miss Marple, who had seated herself beside the mantel, observed them as she might a group of figures on a sampler. Clara barely touched her cake. Leonard was restless, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair. Honoria had not once made eye contact with her nephew. The vicar drank 3 cups of tea and said nothing after the first 10 minutes. "Poor Everard," Elspeth said at last, breaking the conversational dam. "A tragic business." "Tragic," agreed Honoria curtly. Leonard glanced toward the fire. "The man made more enemies than friends. Let's not pretend otherwise." "Elspeth," said Miss Marple gently, "I'm curious. Why did you choose to invite all of us here together? Now?" Elspeth met her gaze directly. "Because I believe someone in this room knows more than they've said." A silence fell. The sort of silence that might settle over a chessboard just before the final move. The fire crackled. Outside, a rook cawed once, then was still. "I believe," Elspeth continued, "that Everard's death was not a simple matter, nor a spontaneous one, and I believe that despite the official inquiries, we are no closer to the truth than we were the morning he was found in that dreadful chair. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. You think someone in this room is responsible? I think, said Elspeth, someone in this room is lying. No one moved. Then Clara spoke, her voice low but steady. He was going to change his will. We all knew it. And yet, said Leonard, he died before doing so. Rather fortunate for some, Honoria's face was expressionless. Are you suggesting I had something to gain? I'm suggesting, said Leonard, that everyone had something to gain or lose. The vicar stood abruptly. This is not appropriate. Elspeth's gaze was unyielding. And yet, it is necessary. The room grew tense, brittle as porcelain. Miss Marple rose quietly. You know, I've always found that when people grow too used to keeping secrets, they become convinced the world cannot see them. But the world does. See, only not all at once. In glimpses, in small, imperfect reflections. She turned to Clara. Miss Burnham, when I visited your cottage, you dropped a teacup. Clara's face blanched, not because of nerves, because you'd seen something in me, a realization you feared. Not of your guilt, but of your knowledge. You saw who went upstairs that night. You heard the voice. You knew. Clara opened her mouth, then closed it. Miss Marple turned to the vicar. And you, Reverend, your sermon was not a cry of righteousness. It was a cry of conscience. You, too, saw something. You heard the quarrel 2 nights before Everard's death, and you recognized a voice not where it belonged. She faced Leonard. You returned to the manor, but not to harm, to beg. You were turned away. Finally, she turned to Honoria. And you, Miss Fawcett, had access to the key. You were the one person never suspected. You were family. You knew the bell would toll at 10, but you arranged for it to toll again, to mask the time. Honoria's teacup trembled. You're mad. No, simply observant. You entered Everard's study that night. You gave him his whiskey. You knew of his intention to name Clara as beneficiary. You couldn't bear it. She's nothing, Honoria whispered, her composure cracking. He was a Fawcett. He had no right to throw it all away on a woman he once loved, Miss Marple said gently, and whom he regretted mistreating. Honoria stood, her eyes wide. Elspeth reached for the bell cord by the mantel. I took the liberty, she said calmly, of inviting Inspector Crail to tea as well. He's waiting in the study. As Honoria was led away, the room remained silent. The air seemed to shift, as though some long-held breath had finally been released. Miss Marple sat again, reached for her now-cold tea, and took a sip. I do believe, she said mildly, that lemon tart tastes best when served with justice. Chapter 9. The button in the library chair. It wasn't there before, and it doesn't belong to anyone who should have been. The afternoon was unusually warm for October, and the sun filtered through the drawing-room windows of Hillside Cottage in slender, golden shafts. Miss Marple, seated at her work-table by the hearth, was finishing the heel of a woolen sock intended for young Freddie Crisp, whose poor mother had taken to her bed again with her usual vague neuralgia. The peaceful domesticity, however, was deceptive. In her mind, Miss Marple was steadily turning over a different kind of pattern, one not of stitches and rows, but of motives, timings, and the lingering scent of betrayal. It was a knock at the door that interrupted her. Florence, who had long since ceased attempting to keep Miss Marple out of other people's business, answered it and announced, Inspector Crail, ma'am, from the station. Crail entered with his usual air of stiff discomfort. His boots were newly polished, and he held his hat awkwardly in one hand, as though it might suddenly take offense. "I thought you'd like to see this," he said, without preamble, and opened his palm. In it lay a single, dark brown button. "Found this," he said, wedged down the side of the library chair at Greystone, the one the Colonel died in. Been checked by the maid before, apparently, but it must have worked its way deeper in. Mrs. Kellett turned the cushions this morning, and it came loose. Miss Marple looked at it with quiet interest. That chair had been searched more than once, had it not? Crail nodded. At least twice. That's what makes this odd, and what's odder still is, none of the Colonel's suits used buttons like this, nor the household staff's uniforms, nor the nephew's. We checked. Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and withdrew a small magnifying glass, a gift from her late cousin Agnes, who had insisted it was unbecoming for a lady to squint, and examined the button more closely. "Wool-coated," she murmured, "with hand-stitched threading. The kind found on women's cardigans in the better sort of department shops. Not mass-produced, not new." She looked up. "This is a woman's button." Crail sighed. "Yes, but there are only 2 women in that house with any regular presence. Honoria Fawcett and the housekeeper, and neither owns a cardigan with a missing button, or so they say." Miss Marple gave him a look as dry as her best scones. "And have you asked Clara Burnham?" Crail blinked. "Miss Burnham? She doesn't even live there." "No," Miss Marple said gently, "but she did visit on more than one occasion. Quietly, often in the afternoons, before the school let out." Crail frowned. "And you believe she might have been in the library the night he died?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that if one finds a woman's button in the depths of a man's chair, that chair in that house, it strongly suggests that someone was seated there who had no business being seated there, or more precisely, no business being present at all." She paused. "Tell me, Inspector, when exactly did Jennings the valet take his evening leave on the night of the murder?" Crail consulted his notebook. "According to Mrs. Kellett, he went up to his room around 9:15. Said he had a headache. That checks with the other staff." "And Martha Kellett?" "Went to her room at 9:30. Miss Marple nodded, slowly, "which leaves the Colonel alone, in the house, with his sister." Crail looked up sharply, "Until he was found the next morning." "Yes, but I no longer believe he was alone." The inspector raised his eyebrows. "You're thinking of Miss Burnham again." "I'm thinking of the button," Miss Marple said, "and I'm thinking of a promise made and broken. I'm thinking of a woman who was once quietly cherished, then publicly dismissed. And I'm thinking of how, on occasion, people return to places not out of malice, but out of longing." Crail sighed. "You're not saying she did it, though?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm saying Clara Burnham sat in that chair, likely just before the Colonel did. I do not believe she poisoned him, but she was there. And now, with the presence of this button, she'll be forced to admit it." Crail rubbed his chin. "And if she lied about that, what else might she be lying about?" Later that day, Miss Marple took a quiet walk to number 4 Wisteria cottages. The rosebush at the gate had gone leggy, and the curtains were drawn against the sun. Clara answered the door in her usual simple dress and cardigan, a dove-grey one this time, neatly buttoned to the neck. "Miss Marple," she said with some surprise, "what a pleasure." Miss Marple smiled. "I came to return something I believe belongs to you." She held out the button. Clara froze. I don't know. Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. You were in the library, weren't you, my dear? That evening, after the others had gone up, you wanted to speak to him one last time, to try and make sense of it. Clara's throat worked, and she sank into the nearest chair. I didn't kill him, she whispered. You must believe me. Yes, I went. He'd written to me the week before, asked me to come, said he'd been wrong, that he wanted to include me again, in his will. And more than that, he said he wanted to make amends. For everything. Miss Marple sat beside her. We spoke, Clara said, her voice shaking. He poured a drink. Whiskey. I didn't touch it. I'd brought him an old book. Poems of Cowper. He always loved Cowper. I sat in the library chair while he fetched his glasses. Then we talked. Not long. 20 minutes, perhaps. I left just before 10. Through the back? Yes. And you told no one? Would you have, Miss Marple? The whispers. The stares. No, said Miss Marple. No, I suppose not. She stood. But the truth always shows its face, my dear, even if it's only in a small, unassuming button. That evening, as twilight curled its fingers over Little Wickford, Miss Marple wrote in her notebook by lamplight, the button confirms presence, not guilt. The letter to Clara, real. The motive, jealousy. The murderer, not Clara. Honoria had opportunity. Clara had love. The final piece, Miss Marple felt, was nearly in place. And tomorrow, at Greystone Manor, the last thread would be pulled. Because buttons, like lies, may come loose when tugged, but eventually they always leave a mark. Chapter 10. A Truth Revealed by Lamplight. In the final hour, Miss Marple lays the pieces gently, fatally, into place. The rain came softly that evening, tapping at the diamond-paned windows of Greystone Manor with a sound like distant typewriter keys, each drop a delicate punctuation mark in the quiet drama yet unfolding within. Inside, the drawing room was lit by lamplight alone, casting soft golden pools onto the threadbare Aubusson rug, the gleam of the decanter on the sideboard, and the spines of leather-bound volumes still lining the shelves like mute witnesses. It was Inspector Crail who stood first, impatient, his boots squeaking faintly as he shifted weight. Well, Miss Marple, he said, not without a hint of deference, you asked us all here, said you had something to reveal. The truth, I believe you said. Miss Marple, in her dove-grey cardigan and a modest brooch shaped like a thistle, sat comfortably in the Queen Anne armchair that had once been Colonel Fawcett's favourite. She looked more like a maiden aunt about to inquire after someone's sore throat than the bearer of revelation. But those who knew her, truly knew her, had long since learned to brace themselves when Jane Marple folded her hands and cleared her throat. Yes, Inspector, she said gently. I believe the time has come to speak plainly. Seated around her, the assembled figures formed a tableau of tension. Leonard Fawcett, shoulders stiff, arms crossed tightly over his chest. Clara Burnham, pale and subdued, her eyes fixed on her hands in her lap. Reverend Burrows, brows knitted as though waiting for a confession he didn't wish to hear. And Honoria Fawcett, composed as ever, seated beside the hearth with the air of someone quite prepared to endure a tedious afternoon and put an end to nonsense once and for all. The Colonel, Miss Marple began, was not a loved man. Let us not pretend otherwise. He was proud, rigid, and deeply wounding to those closest to him. He made promises, broke them, and believed himself blameless. And yet, despite all this, he was capable of affection, though seldom expressed. and had in recent weeks begun to feel the pull of his own mortality. No one spoke. Outside, the wind had begun to stir, rattling the ivy along the window sills. It was in that spirit, I believe, that he wrote to Miss Burnham, asking her to visit, intending to make amends and revise his will once again. This Clara confirmed. She met with him the night of his death. They spoke in this very room. Inspector Crail nodded. "We know that now, yes. And the button—" "Precisely," Miss Marple said. The button confirmed what Clara herself confessed when asked directly, but what is more interesting is what happened after she left, because it was then, between her departure and the house's stillness, that something changed. She turned to Honoria, her eyes mild behind their spectacles. "You said you went up to bed at 9:30. "I did," Honoria replied coolly, "and yet the Colonel was seen alive at 10 o'clock, when the bell tolled as always. It was 10 minutes later when it tolled again, unusually, and not by any mechanical fault. That second toll was deliberate." Leonard shifted. "To change the time of death," he said slowly. "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "to create confusion. To make it appear that the Colonel died after Clara had left. A clever trick, but not clever enough." She looked again at Honoria. "You claim to have been in your room all night, and yet it was your key that unlocked the library door. And it was you who brewed the Colonel's nightly whiskey. You who stood most to lose, should he complete his plans to change his will." "I stood to lose nothing," Honoria said with quiet venom. "My brother made his intentions clear. His affections were variable. He was going to leave everything to Clara," Miss Marple said softly, "including this house." The words hung in the air. "She never wanted it," Miss Marple continued, "but he wanted to give it, a final gesture of recompense. But you couldn't allow it, not after everything. And so, after Clara left, you came down again. You poured another drink, poison this time. You gave it to him, watched him drink it, and then you rang the bell." Honoria laughed once, short and brittle. "That's absurd." Miss Marple's gaze never wavered, except that you made one mistake. She reached into her reticule and drew out a small envelope. Inside it, carefully pressed, was a folded piece of paper. She handed it to Inspector Crail, who read it slowly, his brow darkening. "The will," he muttered. "A new one, dated the very day he died. Found not in the solicitor's files, but folded neatly in a volume of Cowper's poems," Miss Marple said. "A book Clara had given him. He must have hesitated, undecided whether to post it the next morning. But he signed it, he left it ready, and he placed it in a book he meant to keep." She turned once more to Honoria. "Did you not think to check there, or did you believe no one would ever find it? That your actions would secure everything as it was before?" There was a silence. Then Honoria stood, slowly, her gloved hands smoothing the front of her skirt. Her face was utterly expressionless. He would have destroyed everything. For her, she turned to Clara with a look of such cold hatred that Clara flinched. "She took what little peace he had left me." "I took nothing," Clara whispered. Miss Marple rose, and in her voice was the softness of finality. "I think we are done here, Inspector." Crail stepped forward, gently but firmly placing a hand on Honoria's shoulder. "I'm afraid we are." As she was led away, the wind finally ceased, leaving only the quiet ticking of the long case clock and the faint rustle of papers disturbed by breath and justice. Miss Marple poured herself a small glass of sherry from the decanter and took a seat once more in the Colonel's armchair. She looked around the room, now quieter than it had ever been. "A dreadful business," murmured Reverend Burrows, "and yet, how easily it might have remained hidden." Miss Marple nodded. "Easily. Had it not been for a lace handkerchief, a button in a chair, a tolling bell, and the kind of pride that cannot abide being forgotten." She sipped her sherry and let the silence return. Outside, the clouds had lifted, and moonlight silvered the hedgerows. In the distance, the bell tower of St. Mildred's stood still. At last, all was quiet in Little Wickford, but somewhere the echo of a second chime still lingered.